Before we begin, take a slow breath. Let your shoulders settle. Let the day fade behind you. There is no hurry here, only quiet stories from long ago, spoken gently and meant to soothe. We're going far back in time, before courtrooms and contracts, before laws were carved into stone. A time when justice still existed, but had no name, no ink, no record, just memory, just rhythm, just the quiet understanding that life must move in balance. Let's begin. Imagine a village. It's small, nestled along a river bend, where the earth is soft and black, and the trees grow close together. The homes are shaped from mud and straw, round at the base and topped with simple thatched roofs. They sit low to the ground, warm in the cool mornings and cool in the hot afternoons. Smoke curls gently from a few chimneys as the sun rises. A soft orange glow begins to stretch across the roofs. A child stirs beside a clay hearth. The faint sound of grinding stone echoes from a neighbouring home. A goat bleats. Birds hop along fence posts. The day begins without alarm. This is long before scribes, scrolls, and seals. There is no government, no police, no written law. And yet, these people know what fairness feels like. If someone steals, it's known. If someone lies, it spreads. Not in anger, not at first, but in quiet disapproval. There is no list of offences, but there are boundaries, shared lines, invisible and powerful. These early societies run on memory, on trust, on repetition. The same meals, the same walks, the same agreements. Passed down, not by ink, but by habit. Everyone knows what's expected, because everyone has seen it lived. Disputes happen, of course. A broken tool, a trampled field, a hunter who kept more meat than he should have. And when they do, the village doesn't gather in a hall. It simply leans in, calmly, naturally, toward resolution. Most people speak to their neighbours first. They try to fix it. But if the wound remains, the matter goes to someone older, someone with grey hair, quiet eyes, and a voice that doesn't rise. An elder. Elders don't carry titles. They carry time. They've seen births and deaths, droughts and harvests. They've told stories beside the fire and watched the stars change shape over the years. When they speak, it's not with authority. It's with memory. They ask questions. They wait. They nod. And then they speak. Their decision isn't written down. It's carried by those who heard it, by those who trust them. And most of the time, that's enough. The idea of punishment looks different here. There are no prisons, no fines, no exile. Instead, there's shame, there's withdrawal. A person who wrongs the village might find themselves alone at the fire, unspoken, uninvited, not forever, just long enough to feel the weight of their actions. But more often, there's repair. A borrowed animal returned, a broken gate mended, a gift of food, a gesture of apology. Forgiveness is not a ceremony, it's a moment, often quiet, when the community decides to move forward. This kind of justice isn't fast, and it isn't always fair, but it's real. It's built into the breath of the village, not something separate, but something woven through it. Long before tablets, long before courts, long before the word law was ever spoken, there was justice, not perfect, not precise, but present. In firelit stories, in the rhythm of shared labour, in the look exchanged between two people who remember what happened last year and what was done to make it right. And in this still, early world, where stars shine brighter and silence runs deeper, that was enough. Justice lived in the spaces between people. Software human, remembered. Now take another breath. Let the sounds of that distant village fade for now. We'll return to them and others soon. But first, let's move forward to where law took its first written form, carved in clay. Let's take another breath together. We're moving slowly now, from memory to inscription, from spoken rules to carved ones. The world is still quiet, still simple, but something is changing. A shift toward permanence, toward record, toward law that can be seen and touched. Let's travel to the land between the rivers, to Mesopotamia. The sun rises over the flat plains of ancient Sumer. Dusty wind rolls across the open fields, where barley grows in thick rows along the irrigation canals. At the heart of the settlement stands a ziggurat, tall, stepped, and made of sun-baked brick. Below it, streets twist through neighborhoods of tightly packed homes, clay walls, wooden doors, roofs made of reeds and rope. It's here, in this early city, that law first becomes visible, not just remembered, written. Sumerian kings were not merely rulers. They were seen as stewards of order, guardians of balance, and with that came the need to define behavior clearly, to set expectations in stone, or more precisely, in clay. One of the earliest examples we know of is the Code of Ur-Numma, written around 2100 BCE. It's not as famous as Hammurabi's, but it came first, a soft beginning to the long story of written justice. The tablets are small, rectangular, filled with lines of wedge-shaped cuneiform. The language is simple, even gentle in places. It begins with a prologue, a quiet declaration that the king was chosen by the gods to bring peace and fairness to the land. Then it lists the rules. If a man commits a robbery, he shall be put to death. If a man divorces his wife, he shall pay her silver. If a slave marries a free woman, their children are free. Clear, director, not exhaustive, but present. And then came Hammurabi. 2 centuries later, his code would go further, longer, more detailed, more symbolic. Etched into a tall basalt stele, nearly 8 feet high, crowned by a carving of the king receiving the laws from the god Shamash. This wasn't just legislation. It was performance. It was sacred. The Code of Hammurabi includes 282 laws, covering everything from property disputes and inheritance to trade, theft, marriage, assault, and contracts. If a builder builds a house and it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a man blinds another man's eye, his eye shall be blinded. If a doctor causes death during surgery, his hands shall be cut off. These are not gentle rules, but they are careful. They reflect a world that values order, sometimes harshly, but always deliberately. A world where fairness means consequence, and consequence must be visible. What's important to understand is that these laws weren't always enforced to the letter. Often, local judges made decisions based on custom, circumstance, and community standing. But the presence of a written law, a public physical record, changed how people understood justice. It added permanence. It removed uncertainty. And in a society where not everyone could read, the very existence of a carved law still mattered. It stood as a symbol, a monument to order, a declaration that the gods had placed fairness into the hands of the king, and the king had placed it into the clay. So here, in the warm dust of Mesopotamia, beneath the watchful gaze of temple towers and date palms, humanity took a step. From spoken rule to written law, from memory to monument. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fair by today's standards, but it was a beginning. A quiet, deliberate beginning, still echoing through time. Now breathe out. Let the sounds of reed pens and hammering chisels fade. In the next chapter, we'll step into Babylon's courts and see how law looked in action. In the heart of ancient Babylon, life moved with purpose. Clay streets bustled with traders, scribes, servants, and merchants. Behind the noise, behind the daily hum of commerce and harvest, there was structure, a deep, steady framework meant to keep the city balanced. This was not a place where conflict was rare. It was a place where conflict was inevitable and expected. Theft, injury, land disputes, accusations of betrayal or negligence, all were part of life. But Babylon did not leave these things to chance. Here, justice meant consequence. Not just rules carved into stone, but systems, ways to settle arguments, correct wrongs, and re-establish harmony in the city. When someone broke the law, they were brought before a judge, a real person, often chosen from respected men in the community. These judges worked within temples, beneath shaded halls filled with pillars and carvings. They sat on stone benches and listened. Sometimes the accused spoke for themselves. Other times, neighbors testified. There were no lawyers, just people, words, gesture, reputation, and memory. If the matter couldn't be settled with testimony alone, a judge might order an oath, a formal declaration in the name of a god. Swearing falsely in such a setting was not just illegal, it was dangerous. You weren't just risking a punishment, you were offending the divine. And in certain situations, guilt was determined by what's called trial by ordeal. The most famous, the river. If a person was accused of sorcery, or if no clear evidence could be found, the court might order them to jump into the river. If they sank and drowned, they were considered guilty. If they floated or survived, the gods had spoken. They were innocent, harsh, crude, and yet deeply embedded in the worldview of the time. Punishments in Babylon were based on status and severity. A noble striking another noble might pay a fine. But if that same noble struck a commoner, the consequence could be more severe. The law was not equal, but it was structured, predictable in its own way. For theft, the punishment could be death. For breaking a dam and flooding a neighbour's field, repayment, often in grain. For false accusations, public shaming, or a financial penalty. For adultery, especially among married women, execution was possible, though many cases were quietly resolved in private, depending on the husband's decision. One of the most well-known principles was lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But in practice, this wasn't always literal. In many cases, fines replaced injuries. Compensation was paid, a sheep, a measure of grain, a portion of silver. The important thing was balance, that the harm caused was made visible, and something was done to restore the scales. Even in a world with harsh laws, people often found ways to soften them. Judges might mediate instead of punish. Families might agree to settlements. Neighbours might step in and help resolve tension before it reached the temple steps. Justice was not just about punishing the guilty, it was about protecting the peace. So in Babylon, law was not a sword, it was a structure, something people moved within, something that held the city together, imperfect, uneven, but constant. And while the names of judges are lost, and the voices of the accused have long faded, the spirit of that system remains. A desire for order, a belief in fairness, and the quiet hope that when things went wrong, someone, somewhere, would make it right. In ancient Egypt, law was more than a list of rules. It was a reflection of cosmic balance. The people of the Nile, didn't think of justice as something separate from daily life. It wasn't a courtroom process or a civic duty. It was an expression of ma'at, a divine principle that stood for truth, order, harmony, and rightness. Ma'at was not just an idea. She was a goddess. She wore a single ostrich feather on her head, and that feather became the symbol of balance. Everything, from the flooding of the river to the honesty of a merchant, was believed to rest on her unseen scales. To disturb Ma'at was to invite chaos, and law in Egypt existed to prevent that. The highest authority in the land was the pharaoh. He was not only king, but the living embodiment of divine order. To rule was to preserve Ma'at, to build temples, settle disputes, manage the harvest. All of it was part of keeping the balance. But the pharaoh didn't judge every case himself. Justice flowed downward, like the Nile. The vizier, the pharaoh's most trusted official, oversaw the legal system. Beneath him were scribes, priests, and local officials, men trained not just in reading and writing, but in maintaining order with patience and care. When someone committed a crime or had a dispute, they would appear before a judge or appointed official, often in a temple courtyard or administrative hall. They would present their case. Sometimes they brought witnesses, sometimes a written petition. The scribe would record everything on a sheet of papyrus, names, testimony, and outcomes. These records, fragile as they were, give us a rare glimpse into the everyday conflicts of Egyptian life. Arguments over land, unpaid debts, broken promises, and even insults traded between neighbors. Punishment, as in other ancient cultures, could be severe. Serious crimes like theft, murder, or temple desecration were dealt with harshly, sometimes with beatings, exile, or execution. In some cases, the accused was forced to make a public confession, kneeling before an image of the gods, speaking their guilt aloud. But for lesser offences, restitution was more common. A lost item returned, a debt repaid, an apology made in front of a gathering. The goal was not only to correct the wrong, but to restore the balance Ma'at required. Justice was seen as a cleansing, something that returned the world to its proper state. And for Egyptians, justice didn't end in this life. They believed that after death, the soul would be judged in the Hall of Two Truths. There, the heart of the deceased would be placed on one side of a scale. On the other side, the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it would tip the scale. The soul would be devoured by a beast called Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. But if the heart was light, if the person had lived in truth, they would pass into the field of reeds, a serene, eternal version of life beside the Nile. This belief, that actions mattered beyond death, shaped behavior in life. It encouraged honesty, patience, respect, not out of fear of punishment, but out of a desire to live rightly and to die with a heart light enough to rise. In Egypt, law was not separate from belief. It was sacred, it was quiet, and it was everywhere. To walk in Ma'at was to live in peace with the world, and even now, thousands of years later, we can still feel the calm of that ancient idea. That justice is not force, but balance, like a feather floating in still air. If Egyptian justice was built on silence and sacred order, Greek justice was anything but quiet. In classical Athens, the birthplace of democracy, law wasn't handled by kings or priests. It belonged to the citizens, and with that came energy, opinion, noise, and a deep belief that everyone deserved a voice. Courtrooms in ancient Athens were not rooms at all. They were open-air spaces, courtyards, porticos, public squares, filled with men gathered under the sun, talking, arguing, listening, deciding. There were no professional judges, no lawyers in robes, just citizens, hundreds of them, chosen by lot to serve as jurors. This was the dikasterion, the Athenian court, and it was loud. The process began with a complaint. Anyone, rich or poor, could bring a case if they felt wronged. Theft, slander, unpaid debts, assault, broken contracts, all could be brought before the people. Once accepted, the case moved forward with urgency. Speeches were prepared, witnesses gathered, evidence, often limited, was assembled. On the day of the trial, jurors would line up to receive bronze ballots. Their numbers could range from a few hundred to over 1,000. It was a system designed to prevent corruption. One man could be bribed, but 500, less likely. There were no judges to guide the argument. The plaintiff and the defendant would speak for themselves, each given a fixed amount of time measured by a water clock, a vessel that slowly dripped until it emptied. The speeches were dramatic, personal, and often emotional. Men cried, shouted, pleaded. Some brought their children to court, hoping their presence would sway the jury. Once both sides were heard, the jurors cast their votes, dropping small discs into urns marked for guilt or innocence. There was no deliberation, no discussion. The numbers were tallied. The outcome was final. Punishments ranged from simple fines to exile, from the loss of citizenship to, in rare and severe cases, death. Even Socrates, the philosopher, stood in front of an Athenian jury. Accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, he made his defense calmly, knowingly. He was found guilty. When asked to propose his own punishment, he suggested free meals for life. The jury sentenced him to death. Despite the chaos, the Athenian legal system was, in its own way, deeply democratic. It gave power to ordinary people. It allowed citizens, not kings, to shape justice. It wasn't always fair. It was often theatrical. But it was alive. Athenians believed that speech was sacred, that truth came from public struggle, from debate and voice and argument. Silence to them was not peace, it was absence. So they talked, and through all the noise, the shouting, the clatter of sandals on stone and the hiss of water clocks counting down, justice was served. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't gentle, but it was theirs. And for the people of Athens, that was justice, loud, proud, and fully human. In ancient Rome, law wasn't mystical or emotional, it was practical. The Romans believed that a well-run society depended on rules that could be written, followed, and enforced with precision. Where the Greeks prized oratory and the Egyptians spoke of cosmic balance, the Romans built a system of law that was administrative, ordered, and enduring. And they wrote everything down, on tablets, on scrolls, on waxboards in courtyards, on marble plaques in public squares. The laws were visible, legible, and everywhere. The cornerstone of Roman legal thought was the 12 Tables, created around 450 BCE, a set of laws inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed in the forum where every citizen could read them. These weren't philosophical musings or divine commands. They were blunt, practical rules. They spelled out debts, inheritances, contracts, property rights, burial procedures, and punishments. If a man breaks another man's bone, let him pay 300 coins. If a patron defrauds his client, let him be cursed. If a tree leans over into another man's field, it must be cut down. Simple, director, public. As the empire grew, so did its legal needs. Rome developed layers of courts, local, regional and imperial. There were magistrates, governors, praetors, and appointed judges. Legal experts called jurisconsults studied old cases and advised magistrates on how to interpret the law. There were codes for citizens, for soldiers, for slaves, for foreigners. Each case was recorded. Each decision became precedent. The Romans were not just trying to settle disputes. They were trying to build a system that could outlive the moment. They succeeded. Roman law became the backbone of legal thinking across the Western world. Its influence is still seen today in legal codes, court structures, and even modern terms like subpoena, contract, and testimony. But beneath the layers of formality, Roman justice still came down to people. A merchant accused of fraud, a farmer arguing over property lines, a freedwoman defending her inheritance. The court might be grand, but the problem was always human. Witnesses were called, documents read aloud, contracts presented with wax seals and signatures. Judges listened, scribes recorded, and rulings were given, sometimes with fairness, sometimes with bias, but always with the weight of structure behind them. For the Romans, law was a kind of architecture, something that could be built, reinforced, and repaired. It held the empire together, not with swords, but with scrolls, not with silence, but with stamps, seals, and signatures. And in the quiet rhythm of Roman paperwork, there was a kind of peace. Because when the rules were clear, when the process was known, people could live and sleep a little more easily. Even now, that quiet order still echoes like footsteps on marble. In ancient India, law was more than a set of rules. It was a way of life, shaped not by commands or fear, but by a principle called dharma. Dharma wasn't simply law in the legal sense. It was balance, duty, harmony with the world. A deeply rooted belief that every person, every action, and every moment had its rightful place, and that justice came from honoring that place with care. Where Rome had documents and Athens had speeches, India had dharma. Written, yes, but also lived. This idea appears as early as the Vedas, the sacred hymns of early Indian society. It continued through the Dharma Shastra, our texts, vast, thoughtful works that explored everything from ethics to inheritance to marriage, caste, cleanliness, and criminal punishment. One of the most influential of these was the Fanza Manusmriti, the Laws of Manu, composed over 2,000 years ago. Not a code in the Western sense, but a flowing text filled with verses. It described the duties of rulers and priests, the expectations of householders and hermits, the roles of artisans, warriors, teachers, and kings. And through it all ran a quiet thread. Justice was not about force. It was about alignment. When a person strayed from their path, it created imbalance. Suffering followed. But when they followed Dharma, when they lived with honesty, patience, and discipline, peace returned. In everyday life, disputes in ancient India were often handled at the village level. Local councils, known as panchayats, gathered beneath shady trees or in courtyards. They were composed of respected elders, not elected, not appointed, but trusted. Their power came not from titles, but from wisdom and the community's faith in their fairness. If a fence was moved or a debt unpaid, the villagers brought the matter to the panchayat. There were no written complaints, no lawyers, just words, offered softly, heard fully, weighed carefully. The council would listen to both sides. Sometimes they'd ask questions, sometimes they'd pause in long silence, and eventually a decision would come. Often it was restorative, a promise made. a wrong reversed, a hand extended. In more serious cases, involving violence, large debts, or land rights, the dispute might reach the ruler or one of his appointed officials. The king, or a Raja, was considered the protector of Dharma. His duty wasn't just to punish, it was to uphold harmony in the realm. But even kings weren't above Dharma. Ancient stories often depict rulers who stray from justice, only to suffer downfall and shame. The idea was clear. True law was universal. No one, not even royalty, could twist it for personal gain and escape consequence. Temples and monasteries sometimes played a role as well. Monks, ascetics, and Brahmins served not just spiritual functions, but legal ones. They mediated family conflicts, offered advice on moral questions, maintained community balance when the official courts were distant or slow. Punishments varied, fines were common. Public shame was used carefully. In rare cases, physical punishment or exile was applied, but always with emphasis on proportion. And unlike many ancient systems, there was often an avenue for mercy. Confession, repentance, ritual purification. These weren't just spiritual acts, they were part of a broader system of repair, emotional, communal, and practical. Throughout it all, Dharma remained the thread. It taught that justice wasn't something imposed from above. It came from within, from stillness, from discipline, from compassion. It reminded people that a peaceful world began with peaceful choices. There were no grand courtrooms, no roaring juries, only shaded trees, soft voices, and long pauses. A justice system not made of marble, but of trust. And in that trust, ancient India found its balance. In ancient China, law was not a shared agreement between citizens. It was an extension of the emperor's will. Where Athens gave voice to the people and India sought inner harmony, China built a system of justice designed to preserve order on a grand scale, quiet, firm, and immovable. The emperor sat at the top. Beneath him, a vast web of officials, clerks, governors, scribes, and judges stretched across the empire. From palace courts in Chang'an and Luoyang to dusty village halls in distant provinces, law was carried like a lantern, passed hand to hand, meant to illuminate the furthest corners of the realm, and above all else, it was meant to control. Chinese legal philosophy developed alongside two powerful schools of thought, Confucianism and legalism. Confucianism emphasized virtue, the idea that good rulers, through moral example, would inspire good behavior. Harmony came from proper relationships, father and son, ruler and subject, elder and youth. Legalism, on the other hand, was colder. It believed that people were naturally selfish, and only strict rules and swift punishments could prevent chaos. Clear laws, harsh enforcement, predictable outcomes. During the Joseon dynasty era in the 3rd century BCE, legalism dominated. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, unified the land and imposed a tightly controlled legal code. Punishments were severe, spies were common, books were burned, dissent was crushed. But even as dynasties shifted, from Qin to Han, from Han to Tang, the legal system endured, not always brutal, but always structured. Each dynasty revised the laws, adapting them to the needs of the age, yet always keeping them as tools of imperial control. At the village level, justice was often handled by local magistrates, men who served as judge, administrator, and investigator all at once. They sat in wooden halls with scrolls beside them and clerks at their feet. Behind them, tablets listing laws hung from beams. Before them, villagers knelt to present complaints. disputes over land, thefts of livestock, debts unpaid, marriages gone wrong. Magistrates were expected to be wise, patient, and decisive, but they were also expected to produce results. They questioned witnesses, weighed evidence, sometimes used physical punishment to extract confessions, especially in more serious cases: bamboo rods, whippings, public shaming. It was not a gentle system, but it was organized. Written law was everywhere. China maintained detailed legal codes, revised and republished with each dynasty. The Hotang Code, created in the 7th century CE, was one of the most sophisticated of its time, categorizing crimes, penalties, procedures, and exceptions with extraordinary care. It outlined exact punishments for theft, assault, bribery, adultery, fraud, and treason. Penalties varied by status. The same act might receive a different punishment depending on who committed it and against whom. There were 5 degrees of punishment: beatings with light or heavy sticks, penal servitude, exile, and death. Some were reduced for age or confession. Others were increased for lying or for crimes committed at night. But it wasn't just about punishment. The law also guided behavior, reinforcing respect, filial piety, loyalty, and social roles. It reflected the belief that society worked best when everyone stayed in their proper place. Yet, within the machinery of law, there was still room for reflection. Petitions could be sent to higher courts. Governors could pardon. The emperor himself could overrule a sentence. Sometimes, punishments were delayed during festivals. Other times, whole villages mourned when a just magistrate was reassigned. And through it all, law continued, steady as ink, sharp as brushstrokes. In ancient China, justice was not warm, but it was stable. And for many, that stability brought peace. Not freedom, not equality, but quiet predictability. A world where the rules were known and the consequences clear. And in the eyes of the empire, that was enough to keep the silence. Justice, like language or food or architecture, takes different shapes across the world. But beneath the differences, the rituals, the codes, the punishments, the purpose remains the same: to keep the peace, to restore balance, to answer the quiet question, what happens when someone is wronged? In Egypt, the answer was Ma'at, the feather of truth. In Greece, it was the voice of the people. In India, Dharma guided the way. In China, the emperor's law brought order. In Mesopotamia, it was the written word, etched in clay, left in the open sun. And in each of these ancient worlds, law was not just a tool, it was a mirror. In Babylon, a merchant might be judged by how evenly he measured grain. A builder might be held accountable if a wall collapsed. A farmer could be punished for letting his canal flood a neighbour's field. But in India, that same farmer might sit beneath a banyan tree, explaining his case to a circle of elders. No tablets, no scribes, just memory, reputation, and the community's quiet need for harmony. In Greece, a man might stand in the agora and argue his case before hundreds of fellow citizens, his voice rising and falling like a wave. In Rome, he might sign a contract in front of witnesses, seal it with wax, and trust the courts to enforce it. In Egypt, he might pray. He might ask the gods to weigh his heart. The differences weren't only in process, they were in belief. The Greeks believed in debate, the Chinese in hierarchy, the Indians in spiritual balance, the Romans in structure, the Babylonians in clarity. And yet, the pattern repeats. Almost every society, no matter how ancient, had systems for theft and assault, for land and labour, for debt and divorce. Every civilization had methods for judging guilt, offering proof, assigning consequence. Some used beatings, others used exile. Some relied on restitution, others used oaths or trials by ordeal. But none of them chose anarchy. No society, no matter how early, abandoned the idea of fairness altogether, because justice was necessary, not just for survival, but for meaning. Across the world, law took on the shape of the land. In river valleys, it followed the rhythm of water, slow, cyclical, written on clay. In mountainous regions, it clung to oral tradition, passed through elders and stories. In cities, it became public, loud, visible, argued in the open. In temples, it became sacred, tied to ritual, shaped by the divine. And in homes, small, smoky, filled with quiet chores, it became personal, a broken tool, a false promise, a debt not paid. Justice didn't always come from the capital. Often, it came from a neighbour, a friend, an elder who remembered how similar problems were solved before. What we call law was never just one thing. It was culture, faith, necessity, and memory, all woven together. It was how people learned to live beside one another, to forgive, to repay, to rebuild, to say this was wrong, but it can be made right. And even though the words have changed, from cuneiform to Latin, from Sanskrit to parchment, the impulse remains to draw a line, to name the wrong, and to try, as gently as possible, to begin again. Now that we've walked through temples and courtrooms, listened to scribes and elders, followed scrolls and feathers and voices through thousands of years, we come to the end. Not of law, but of our quiet look at where it came from. Because law never really began in one place. It rose slowly in the cracks between people, in stolen bread and broken fences, in soft arguments and louder ones, in the spaces where life brushed against life and someone had to decide what came next. What we find in ancient law isn't just rules, it's us, our hopes, our fears, our endless search for balance. We see it in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, not just the codes, but the way they were placed in public. Not hidden, not whispered, visible, known. We see it in the weight of Ma'at, in the Egyptians' belief that the heart should be light to pass into the next world. That justice lived not only in what you did, but in how you carried yourself through life. We see it in the arguments of Athens, loud, passionate, imperfect, but open, in the courage it took to stand in front of your peers and speak, knowing they would decide your fate. We see it in Rome's paperwork, the quiet confidence that order could be preserved through signatures, stamps, and the slow power of consistency. We see it in India's panchayats, decisions made under trees, surrounded by familiar faces, where justice wasn't distant or severe, but close and human. And we see it in the long corridors of Chinese bureaucracy, where every document, every ruling, every petition was part of a vast machinery meant to hold a nation together, even as it shifted and grew. These systems were different, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, sometimes sacred, sometimes cold, but all of them meant something to the people who lived inside them. They brought stability, or fear, or relief. They helped people sleep, or kept them awake. And for those of us looking back from far away, they offer something else: perspective. They remind us that the idea of fairness, of wrong and right, of harm and healing, isn't modern, it isn't Western, it isn't new. It's one of the oldest things we carry. Today we talk of laws as systems, but underneath the systems are people. The mother who wants her land back, the man accused of stealing a cow, the neighbour who swears he never touched the fence, the judge who pauses before deciding, the scribe who records the words. All of them still feel familiar, still close, because even now, thousands of years later, we still long for the same things: clarity, protection, a voice, a way to be heard, a path to set things right, and maybe, most of all, a little peace when the day is over. So tonight, as you rest, know this: long before modern courts and police and contracts, people tried to be fair, tried to listen, tried to keep life steady. And that quiet effort, across centuries and continents, is something we still live in today. We are not so far from them, and they were not so different from us.